June 1941. The sun hadn't even fully broken through the horizon when the silence of the eastern border was shattered by a deafening roar. Thousands of German cannons opened fire simultaneously, as if the sky itself were splitting apart. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. On the other side, Soviet territory was still asleep, but not for long. Endless columns of tanks advanced across the land, raising clouds of dust and smoke. Heavy armored vehicles crushed fences, fields and roads beneath their steel tracks. Trucks loaded with soldiers sped across the border, while Luftwaffe planes cut through the sky, diving to bomb bases, cities, and any sign of resistance. It was a war machine in full motion. The German soldiers, many still young, looked around confidently, some even with a certain enthusiasm. They believed they were participating in a quick, almost inevitable campaign. The propaganda had done its work. The enemy seemed weak, disorganized, incapable of resisting Germany's overwhelming force, and in the first few days, it seemed like they were right. Villages were taken in a matter of hours. Soviet troops were surrounded before they even understood what was happening. Roads were crowded with prisoners, thousands of them, marching under the cold gaze of the invaders. Equipment was abandoned. Positions fell one after another. It was an avalanche of iron, fire, and blood. The Germans advanced so quickly that sometimes they didn't even wait for the infantry. The tanks simply pressed on, leaving behind pockets of resistance that would be crushed later. It was blitzkrieg in its most brutal form, but there was something in the air, something that few people noticed at that moment. The distances were enormous, far greater than any previous campaign. Every kilometer advanced meant longer, more fragile supply lines. Each victory pushed the army further into a vast, unknown, and unforgiving territory. Still, nobody wanted to think about it. For those men, this was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. They believed that even before the snow fell, it would all be over, that they would return home as heroes, with medals on their chests and stories of a swift victory. They didn't know that they were marching straight into one of the greatest nightmares in the history of warfare, and that the very land that now seemed conquered would soon begin to devour them. The army that should never stop in the days that followed the start of the invasion, the German advance, not only continued, it became almost impossible to stop. It was as if all the accumulated force of the German war machine had been unleashed at once, pushing into the Soviet Union with a speed that not even the commanders themselves had accurately predicted. The roads, often precarious and covered in dust or mud, were filled with endless columns of vehicles. Tanks advanced alongside trucks, motorcycles, and troops on foot. The noise was constant. Roaring engines, screeching metal chains, orders shouted by officers who could barely be heard amidst the chaos. It was a continuous, almost uninterrupted flow of men and machines. But it wasn't just speed, it was pressure. Caught off guard in the early days, the Soviet troops tried to organize some form of defense. Some resisted bravely, others were simply crushed before they could react. What could be seen along the way were fields marked by destruction. Destroyed Soviet tanks still smoking, abandoned trucks, weapons scattered on the ground, and bodies left behind in the haste of retreat or surrender. The German advance gave the enemy no time to breathe. Large sieges began to form. Entire cities were isolated, with tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped inside. Without supplies, without efficient communication, many ended up surrendering en masse. Lines of prisoners stretched for miles, exhausted, hungry men walking under armed escort without knowing exactly where. They were being taken. For the Germans, this seemed to confirm everything they had been taught to believe, that they were facing a disorganized enemy, incapable of resisting for very long. And so, they continued advancing, without stopping. There was an almost intoxicating sense of victory. Officers spoke openly about the imminent collapse of the Red Army. Some soldiers wrote letters home, saying that the war would soon be over. that they might not even see winter in that distant territory. But as the front line advanced rapidly, something began to stretch dangerously behind it. The supply lines. Each kilometer gained made it harder to bring in fuel, food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Trucks had to travel ever greater distances. Destroyed or makeshift roads delayed everything. Vehicles broke down. Convoys were forced to stop. And yet, the order was clear. Advance. Always move forward. The commanders knew that the strength of that attack lay in its speed. To stop meant giving the enemy time to reorganize, and that was something they couldn't allow. So even when signs of wear and tear began to appear, engines failing, soldiers exhausted, units falling behind, the advance continued. It was a march that seemed to allow no pauses, no doubts, an army that simply shouldn't stop. But reality, silent and relentless, was beginning to take shape beyond the horizon. The vastness of Russia was not just a backdrop, it was a potential enemy, and the deeper they ventured, the further away any chance of a quick or easy return became. Still, at that moment, nobody wanted to see it, because stopping no longer seemed like an option. The first sign of hell. The cold arrives. Progress continued. But something began to change. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The nights grew longer, quieter, and colder. The wind that had previously only stirred up dust now cut their faces like thin blades. The soldiers felt it first in their hands, then in their feet. An uncomfortable, persistent cold, but still bearable, until it stopped being so. Without warning, the weather changed. The rain came down hard, turning roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles were stuck up to their axles. Tanks, which had previously advanced like unstoppable predators, now struggled to move a few meters. Trucks were stuck, spinning their wheels uselessly, while soldiers pushed with their hands, covered in mud up to their knees. Every advance cost effort, time, and energy. And then, almost overnight, the temperature plummeted, the mud froze, and the world changed completely. The cold arrived like a silent death sentence. It wasn't just discomfort, it was something that invaded the body, slowly consuming every exposed part. Breathing hurt, the air burned the lungs. The simple act of standing still for a few minutes was enough to make the body tremble uncontrollably. The engines started to fail. Oil froze inside the machines. Fuel lost efficiency. Tanks needed to be constantly turned on to avoid complete seizure, but this consumed precious resources. Many simply wouldn't work again. They became abandoned steel carcasses in the snow, motionless witnesses to an advancement that was beginning to lose momentum. Weapons were not spared either. Rifles jammed, machine guns jammed. Soldiers tried to warm metal parts with their bare hands, breathing on them, disassembling and reassembling them in the freezing wind. Every second without a functional weapon was a potential death sentence. And men began to feel the true weight of that invisible enemy. The uniforms weren't made for that. Many were still wearing light clothing, designed for quick campaigns. Now, those same clothes were becoming traps. The cold penetrated the fabric as if it didn't exist. Boots stiffened, feet went numb. Toes lost feeling, then color, then life. The pain came first. A sharp, almost unbearable pain. Then nothing. And that nothing was the most dangerous thing of all. Soldiers began to realize they could no longer move their fingers. Some took off their gloves and saw the white, stiff skin, as if it were no longer part of their body. Others tried to walk, but their legs no longer responded with the same strength. The cold didn't kill quickly. He was taking his time, and during that time he was breaking the man from the inside out. All around, the landscape transformed into a white desert, colorless, soundless, lifeless. Only snow, and the distant echo of a war that now seemed slower, heavier, more cruel. The soldiers began to understand something that no one had said aloud. They weren't prepared for that, and the worst was yet to come, because that was only the beginning of the Russian winter. Soldiers poorly prepared for winter. Now, There was no longer any doubt. The enemy wasn't just the Red Army, it was the cold, and against it, the Germans were dangerously unprepared. The uniforms that had previously seemed adequate, lightweight, practical, made for a quick campaign, now had proved useless. The fabric couldn't retain heat. The wind blew through each layer as if it were nothing. At night, when temperatures plummeted even further, many soldiers simply couldn't sleep. They shivered incessantly, teeth chattering, muscles contracting involuntarily in a desperate attempt by their bodies to generate heat. But the body has limits. Boots began to become a deadly problem. Made for dry terrain, they couldn't withstand the constant ice. Moisture froze inside them. Feet remained wet for hours, sometimes days. First came the discomfort, then the pain, then the total loss of sensation. When they finally took off their boots, many no longer recognized their own feet. The skin would turn pale, then bluish, and in extreme cases, black, dead tissue, frozen flesh. Some tried rubbing it, warming it with their hands, bringing it close to a fire, but often it was too late. The damage was done, and the only solution in the most serious situations was amputation. Without adequate hospitals, without infrastructure, often done right there in the field, insufficient anesthesia, the screams were lost in the icy wind. Their hands suffered the same fate. Stiff fingers, unable to hold a weapon firmly. Some soldiers wrapped rags, pieces of fabric, anything they could find, trying to create makeshift protection. Others stuffed their hands inside their clothes, pressing them against their bodies, trying to retain some warmth. But it didn't always work. The face also paid. The price: frozen noses, stiffened ears, small parts of the body slowly destroyed by the constant cold. Each gust of wind was like an invisible blade cutting through exposed skin. And while the body was failing, the mind began to follow the same path. The exhaustion was extreme, not just physical, but psychological. The feeling of constantly being drained, consumed by something that couldn't be directly fought. There was no way to shoot at the cold. There was no way to escape it. Some soldiers simply stopped. They would sit down for a moment just to rest, they said. They would close their eyes for a few seconds, and they never got up again. His companions quickly learned to fear this kind of silence. A man who was too quiet, too still, was a bad sign. A very bad sign, because in the extreme cold, to stop meant to die. Still, there were orders to follow. Advance, resist, hold your position. But how can you fight when your own body is shutting down? With each passing day, it became clearer that army, which had swept across Europe as an unstoppable force, was now being slowly destroyed by something that had not been taken seriously: winter, and he had not yet shown his full strength. The disappearance begins. It was in this setting of extreme cold, exhaustion, and increasingly stretched lines that something even more unsettling began to happen. At first, they were small signs. A patrol sent for reconnaissance. That never returned. A messenger dispatched with urgent orders, who simply disappeared along the way. Smaller units that, while trying to reposition themselves, completely lost contact with command. Nothing too alarming. At least, not at first. In a war of that magnitude, communication breakdowns were common. Telephone lines were cut, radios malfunctioned, messengers got lost. But there, it started happening far too often. And in a way that's far too strange. Reports began to emerge. An entire platoon sent to occupy an advanced position. Total silence. Not a single shot heard. No calls for help. No survivors returning. Just snow. Untouched. Officials sent out new teams to investigate. Some returned confused, saying they had found nothing but footprints partially obscured by the wind. Others also didn't return. It was as if the landscape itself were swallowing men. The problem was compounded by the vastness of the territory. There were no clear landmarks. Dense forests, open fields covered in snow, abandoned villages. Everything looked the same. Within hours, tracks would disappear completely under new layers of snow. Any attempt to follow the path of a lost unit became nearly impossible, and then came the silence. Entire lines began to go silent. Radios that once transmitted orders and reports now only hissed static. Outposts stopped responding, and the more the command tried to re-establish contact, the more it realized that enormous gaps were opening up on the map. Gaps where men should be. Some soldiers began talking about it amongst themselves in hushed voices, almost like a forbidden secret. They said that certain areas seemed cursed, that whoever entered never returned, that the enemy didn't need to attack. The earth itself did the work. But the reality, while less supernatural, was even more brutal. The extreme cold killed silently. Isolated men without shelter could succumb in a few hours. Snowstorms erased any trace of human presence. And the Soviets, knowing that terrain like no other, took advantage of every weakness, every gap, every isolated unit. They attacked quickly, and they disappeared quickly, without leaving a trace. The result was the same. German units simply ceased to exist. No battle recorded, no clear witnesses, just names that days later were marked as missing. And it started to accumulate. For the soldiers on the front lines, the feeling was unsettling. It wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the fear of vanishing, of disappearing without explanation, without a body, without a story, to be swallowed by the snow as if I had never been there. And as this pattern repeated itself, an uncomfortable truth began to emerge. The army that had been advancing relentlessly was now beginning, little by little, to disappear. Ambushes in the snow. As winter set in and the German advance lost momentum, the enemy that had previously seemed to be retreating in disarray began to show its true colors. The Red Army had not been defeated. It had adapted, and now he hunted. The ambushes began almost invisibly. There were no large, anticipated battles, nor any massive movements detected in advance. Instead, small Soviet groups would appear out of nowhere, attack with brutal precision, and disappear before any response could be organized. The Germans came to fear the landscape itself. Snow-covered forests became hostile territory. Every tree could conceal a sniper. Every shadow could hide a motionless soldier waiting for the right moment to fire. The Soviets wore white clothing, almost indistinguishable from their surroundings, transforming themselves into ghosts on the battlefield. Many Germans only realized they were under attack when the first man fell. A dry shot, a body tumbling in the snow, and then the silence returned, heavy, suffocating. Desperate gazes searched for a direction, an origin. But there was nothing visible, only the infinite white. And then came the second shot, and the third. Soviet snipers operated with almost superhuman patience. They would remain motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the ideal moment. They chose their targets with precision: officers, radio operators, key men. Each shot was not just a death, it was a direct blow to the unit's organization. No leadership, no communication, no control. Chaos was beginning to set in, but it wasn't just the shooters. Soviet ski units began to appear more frequently. They moved with impressive speed across the snow, something the Germans simply couldn't keep up with. They would emerge from the sides, attack supply convoys, eliminate guards, set vehicles on fire, and disappear into the white expanse before reinforcements arrived. Trains have become easy targets. Trucks loaded with food, ammunition, and fuel, already scarce, were intercepted on isolated roads. Drivers were killed without warning. Vehicles were destroyed or captured. Each of these losses was not merely material. It was a death sentence for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of soldiers on the front lines who depended on that supply. And what's worse, many of these ambushes happened without the Germans even being able to clearly see the enemy. It was a psychological war. The constant tension began to wear down the men. No one felt safe, not during the advance, nor during rest. Even at night, inside makeshift shelters, there was the fear that unseen eyes were watching from outside, waiting for the right moment to attack. And often, they were. Patrols sent to secure. The area around the camps would disappear. Small detachments sent to explore nearby areas simply didn't return, and when they did, they brought stories of quick, silent attacks, almost impossible to predict. The Soviets knew every inch of that terrain. They knew where to attack, when to attack, and most importantly, when to disappear. For the Germans, this was something new. They were used to quick, decisive battles, where technological and tactical superiority made the difference. But here, they were fighting an enemy that didn't play by the same rules, an enemy that didn't need to win major battles. All it took was to wear them down, to isolate them, to haunt them, and little by little, eliminate it. The snow, which had previously seemed merely a natural obstacle, now became part of the enemy's strategy. It concealed movements, muffled sounds, and erased tracks. It was a silent accomplice in every attack, and the Germans were beginning to understand, too late, that they were not just facing soldiers. They were facing a war system shaped by the environment itself, a war where the enemy could be just a few meters away and still be completely invisible, and where every step forward could be the last. The forest that swallowed men are, the Russian forests. They were not mere clusters of trees, but living ancestral entities, breathing a primal hatred against the invader. In that winter of 1941, when the Third Reich still believed that the Soviet colossus would fall, like a house of cards under the weight of its panzers, the forests rose like silent sentinels, dense, dark, endless, stretching for hundreds of kilometers mercilessly, without end, like a frozen green-black ocean swallowing entire horizons. For the Germans, accustomed to the open plains of France or the paved roads of Poland, where the blitzkrieg danced with surgical precision, penetrating those forests was crossing a threshold into primordial hell, where the laws of modern warfare dissolved, like snow in fire. There, the most powerful tank became useless, trapped between ancient trunks. The artillery fell silent, unable to aim at what could not be seen, and the man, the proud Aryan soldier, was reduced to a frightened prey stumbling in the knee-deep snow, his heart pounding like an execution drum. The trees, pines as tall as cathedral towers, slender birches like silver ghosts, snow-laden firs hanging like white shrouds, formed an impenetrable canopy. Daylight barely penetrated, reduced to a perpetual twilight, a dirty grey that distorted shapes and deceived the senses. The snow piled on the branches muffled everything. The wind howled outside, but inside the forest reigned a sepulchral, heavy, suffocating silence, as if the air was soaked in wet cotton. Each step crushed the icy crust with a crack that echoed like a distant gunshot, betraying the position of anyone who dared to advance. And in this sonorous vacuum, anything could lurk. A broken branch was no accident. A long shadow was no illusion. It was the perfect stage for ambush, for the terror that fed on invisibility. German patrols were sent out, small groups of 10-15 men, pale faces beneath icy helmets, numb fingers on the triggers of their Mauser and MP40 rifles, bloodshot eyes scanning every moss and ice-covered trunk. They advanced in single file, breathing vapor that condensed on their brows, the cold biting at their exposed skin like wolf teeth, each snap of a branch under. Their boots was a warning that made their pulse quicken. Each rustle of frozen dry leaves seemed like a whisper of death, but the warning rarely came. The first sign of danger was the attack itself, short, precise bursts of Soviet machine guns that seemed to spring from nowhere, from directions impossible to locate, as if the trunks themselves were spitting lead. Grenades flew from invisible holes among twisted roots, exploding in clouds of red-tinged snow. Screams tore through the air, short, guttural, desperate. The sound of a man shot in the chest, another with his leg shattered, a third falling without a sound, the bullet piercing his skull. Then more shots in staccato, the dull thud of bodies falling onto the soft snow. And in the blink of an eye, silence returned, absolute, as if the forest had taken a deep breath and swallowed the chaos. When the reinforcements arrived, breathless, dragging heavy machine guns through the treacherous snow, it was already too late. They found a scene of silent carnage, confused tracks in the fresh snow, mixed with blood that briefly steamed before freezing into black puddles. Bodies scattered among the tree trunks, some still with their hands gripping their rifles, eyes glazed with eternal surprise, others lying face down, as if they hadn't even had time to turn their faces to the enemy. One soldier lay with his neck cut by a silent knife, another with his chest pierced by a bayonet, his blood coagulated into crimson crystals. And all around, nothing. Not a single spent cartridge on the ground to betray the shooter's position. No clear footprints leading anywhere. No cry of victory or groan of a wounded man. It was as if the forest itself had spat out death and closed again, intact, indifferent. The Soviets mastered that labyrinth with a skill bordering on the supernatural. They were sons of the taiga, men of the steppes and Siberian forests, who moved like specters among the branches, shod with improvised skis or felt, boots that wouldn't sink into the snow. They knew hidden trails traced by generations of hunters, paths that snaked between frozen swamps and deceptive clearings. They wore white camouflage cloaks, lying motionless in the snow for hours, even days, their bodies fused to the terrain, their breath controlled so as not to form telltale clouds. Others hid in shelters, dug under the exposed roots of ancient trees, or behind fallen trunks covered in moss, so well disguised that a German could pass within a meter and swear there was nothing there but still life. They attacked with glacial patience. They waited for the exact moment when the wind shifted or the light diminished, and then they struck. A burst of PPSH-41s, spitting lead at close range, a knife to the throat, a grenade rolling silently through the snow, and they disappeared, vanished like smoke, leaving only the muffled echo of their footsteps and the smell of cordite mixed with pine. It was a war of murderous patience, of ambushes that lasted seconds and left scars that lasted eternities. The Germans, trained for quick, coordinated offensives, felt like aliens there. Their radios failed in the tangle of branches, the batteries froze, the antennas entangled in invisible vines. Telephone cables snapped at the slightest touch or were cut by enemy hands. Units separated without realizing it. A platoon would advance 20 meters ahead and suddenly be isolated, surrounded by living walls of wood and ice, completely alone. The fear wasn't the noble terror of a tank charge or an artillery duel. It was something visceral, primitive, that seeped into their bones like the cold. The fear of the invisible, of what lurked behind each tree trunk, of the constant sensation of eyes, dozens, hundreds, fixed on them, watching, calculating the moment to kill. Soldiers swore they heard footsteps in the snow, light as a wolf's, but when they turned the barrel of their guns, nothing. Shadows danced among the branches, humanoid shapes that dissipated before a finger could pull the trigger. The fatigue of the previous day, the cold that gnawed at their toes, the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, everything combined to erode their sanity. Hallucinations surfaced. One man saw the face of a dead comrade smiling among the trees. Another fired into the wind, shouting that the Soviets were coming from all sides. To hesitate for a second was fatal. A second of doubt, and the bullet found its mark in the chest. A second of panic, and the entire group disintegrated in blind gunfire that only alerted the enemy. As the days passed, the orders changed, coming from distant commands that barely understood the horror. Avoid forests whenever possible. Circumvent dense areas. Use open roads, even if exposed. But the routes to Moscow, to the vital objectives, inevitably snaked through those cursed domains. There was no choice. Entering was easy. The terror came later, when the forest closed in like jaws. Many groups entered and never came out again. They disappeared, Without radio, without signal, without a body to bury, the forest swallowed them whole, men, weapons, hopes, and returned only silence, that silence that weighed on the chest like lead, that made the survivors look back with wide eyes, knowing that the next patrol could be theirs. Little by little, the forest acquired a mythical aura among the troops. It wasn't geography, it was a monster, a devourer of souls. The soldiers whispered its name in the tone of a dark legend, the forest that swallows. And in each makeshift camp, around weak fires that barely warmed their hands, faces marked by ice told stories that chilled the blood more than the wind. Of patrols found with open throats, without a single shot fired. Of sentries who disappeared on the night shift, leaving only footprints that vanished into nothingness. The terror wasn't just physical, it was existential. The feeling that nature there was an ally of the enemy, that God or the devil had delivered those forests to the Bolsheviks, and so the forest didn't just kill bodies, it killed souls, slowly, inexorably. It swallowed men and spat out silence, and the silence was the worst of horrors. Hunger, fear, and isolation. When supply lines stretched to the breaking point like the strings of an overstretched bow, the war on the Eastern Front ceased to be an epic of conquest and became a nightmare of mere survival, a slow drowning in snow and misery. The autumn of 1941 had already taken its toll with the Rasputitsa, that infernal mud that sucked up tanks and boots. But the Russian winter, the real winter, the general winter that Napoleon had known in 1812 and which was now repeating itself with redoubled cruelty, transformed the German advance into a funeral march. Convoys that once cut through the steppes like arrows were now ghosts lost on the frozen roads. Many were destroyed by Soviet planes or by guerrillas emerging from the fog. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by blizzards that blinded drivers and froze engines. All that arrived was crumbs, scattered boxes, crushed cans, moldy bread that barely lasted a day. The war machine that once roared with Teutonic precision now groaned with hunger, reduced to a starving skeleton. Hunger didn't come like a punch, but like a slow, insidious poison that seeped into their veins day after day. First, rations were cut in half. The once generous German black bread was now a paper-thin slice. Canned meat was divided into portions that barely covered the palm of a hand. The soldiers, still disciplined, shared what little they had in silent circles, eyes downcast, murmuring prayers to a Führer who seemed ever more distant. They trusted that the next train would come, that the Reich would not abandon them. But the days dragged on into weeks and supplies didn't arrive. What remained was devoured to the bone. Crusts of stale bread that cracked teeth, watery soup made with melted snow and horse bones. Then despair. The artillery horses, once the pride of the batteries, were slaughtered one by one. Knives cut into the still warm meat which froze in the frigid air before it could even be cooked over makeshift fires of damp branches. Some men, mad with hunger, ate raw pieces, blood dripping from their chins, the metallic taste mixed with the salt of their tears. Others scraped the leather from their boots, boiling strips of sole in rusty cans, trying to extract any trace of protein. There were those who chewed pieces of felt from uniforms or boiled dirty rags just to feel something warm go down their throats, filling their empty stomachs with the illusion of satiety. Water was another torment. Everything was frozen. Streams turned to stone. Wells became ice traps. To drink, they melted snow in helmets over weak fires. But fuel was scarce, and the fire required wood that burned poorly, releasing smoke that irritated the lungs. Many, impatient, swallowed snow directly. Icy handfuls that went down like blades, causing intestinal cramps and diarrhea that further weakened their already exhausted bodies. Cold and hunger formed a demonic alliance. The body burned heat to digest nothing, accelerating hypothermia. Soldiers once robust, trained in the academies of Berlin or in the fields of Poland, now staggered like old men, carrying backpacks that weighed like anchors. Each step in the snow was agony, trembling knees, burning lungs, blurred. Vision from flakes that danced like mirages. Physical weakness opened doors to psychological terror, a fear that coiled in the mind like poison ivy. Isolation was the worst poison. Entire units would go days, sometimes weeks, without contact with higher command. Radios silent because of the cold, messengers lost in storms, telephone lines cut by invisible saboteurs. No clear orders, no updated maps, no news from the front. The feeling was one of total abandonment, as if the rest of the army had marched to glory and left them behind, living skeletons in a vast white tomb. Soldiers silently wondered, their empty gazes fixed on the grey horizon. Is there still a front line? Does the Führer still want us alive? Or are we just sacrifices on the altar of Moscow? These doubts were not spoken aloud. Admitting them was to betray faith, to invite panic. But panic came anyway in the endless nights. The nights were the height of horror. Without electricity, without decent fires, the men huddled, together in makeshift shelters. Holes dug in the hardened snow, flimsy tents of torn canvas and branches, or shallow trenches lined with the corpses of comrades to insulate against the cold. There, bodies pressed against each other, sharing the last warmth of gasping breaths, the stench of sour sweat and frozen urine permeating the air. The wind always found cracks, howling like tormented souls, seeping into the seams of inadequate uniforms, summer coats lined with old newspapers disintegrating, woolen gloves. The silence of the night was broken only by sounds no one wanted to hear. The low groans of a man with gangrene in his toes, a dry cough that tore at his lungs, the uncontrollable chatter of teeth from someone trembling to the bone, and worst of all, the absolute silence, the moment when a body stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped suffering. In the morning, at the dawn of a pale and merciless light, it was common to find the neighbor rigid, eyes open and frozen in an expression of mute surprise. No struggle, no heroism, just defeated by the cold, by hunger, by the indifference of the universe. Morale crumbled not with outbursts of mutiny, but with a slow, inexorable erosion, like snow corroding mountains. Once firm gazes became empty, lost in the white void. Movements, once agile, dragged themselves along like those of the condemned. Responses to orders were hoarse monosyllables. The will to fight, that flame that had ignited the invasion, was extinguished, replaced by something more animalistic, the raw instinct to survive another day, another hour. Letters, home, written with trembling fingers by the light of makeshift candles, spoke of longing and "I'll be back soon." But the men knew, deep down, that the return was an illusion. The invincible army now fought against its own body, against the empty stomach that rumbled as an accusation, against the cold that transformed dreams into nightmares of warm homes and fresh bread. It was no longer about conquering Leningrad or Moscow. It was about not freezing to death, about not being the next body left behind, with boots ripped off by more desperate comrades. And in that icy vastness, the line between life and oblivion was thinner than a blade of ice. A soldier would wake up to find his tentmate already blue, without a pulse. Another, trying to light a fire, would faint from weakness and never wake up again. The constant fear, the absolute isolation, the hunger that devoured dignity. Everything converged into a despair that corroded the soul. Some deliriously imagined impossible banquets. Others murmured the names of mothers and fiancés like broken prayers. The terror was not only of imminent death, but of insignificance. To die there, without glory, without a decent burial, swallowed by the snow as if they had never existed. The Reich promised 1,000 years. Russia offered only white oblivion. And so, day after day, week after week, the army that had marched, with pride into the heart of the Soviet Union, transformed into legions of hungry, isolated, terrified specters. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, fear their minds, isolation their hope, until, for many, only the silent desire for the end to come quickly remained, not as victory but as mercy, because in that Russian winter, survival was not triumph, it was the cruelest of punishments, and the snow, impassive, continued to fall, covering the tracks, the bodies, the last frozen tears, swallowing everything, leaving only the wind as witness to a despair that no word could fully describe. The collapse of discipline, with the cold consuming their bodies and hunger corroding any remaining strength, something began to break within the German army, not in the machines, not in the weapons, but in the men. Discipline, which had always been one of the pillars of the German war machine, began to crack. At first, they were small signs. Orders took longer to be carried out. Soldiers hesitated before moving. Some pretended not to hear commands, too busy trying to warm their hands or simply gather the strength to stand. Officers still tried to maintain order, shouting instructions, imposing authority, but their voices no longer had the same effect. Exhaustion was stronger than the fear of punishment. Over time, these signs became more evident. Posts were abandoned for minutes, then for hours. Guards dozed off on duty, unable to fight off extreme exhaustion. Patrols went out and returned, incomplete, not from combat, but because some simply couldn't continue and stayed behind. And to be left behind was to disappear. Hunger made everything worse. Soldiers began hiding food from each other. Petty theft occurred within the units themselves. A piece of bread, a forgotten can, anything could spark conflict. They weren't open fights, but silent tensions, suspicious glances, a breakdown of trust. And without trust, there is no unity. Officers faced a cruel dilemma. Punishing meant further weakening men who were already on the verge of collapse, but not punishing meant losing control completely. Some still tried to maintain rigidity, applying discipline harshly. Others, seeing the reality before their eyes, simply let it pass. Because deep down, everyone was at their limit. Cases began to emerge of soldiers who simply refused to advance. Men who stopped, looked around and said in low, empty voices that they could go no further. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't conscious disobedience. It was utter exhaustion. Some tried to walk, but their bodies wouldn't respond. They fell in the snow, trying to get up again, but without strength. Companions sometimes helped, pulling, carrying them for a few meters, until they realized they were putting their own survival at risk. And then came the most difficult decision: follow or stay. Many followed, and those who stayed behind were left behind, with the snow slowly covering their still living bodies. The fear of being the next one unable to continue spread among the men. Every step was a test, every order a test of endurance, and the line between fulfilling one's duty and simply giving up was beginning to disappear. Some soldiers, in moments of desperation, made unthinkable decisions. They abandoned positions without authorization. They tried to find their own way out of that white hell. But the terrain was unforgiving. Without guidance, without supplies, these attempts almost always ended the same way: disappearance. Poor communication made everything worse. Without clear orders, without a solid structure, entire units began to operate in a disorganized manner. What was once a coordinated army now seemed fragmented, broken into small groups trying to survive on their own. And in the midst of all this, the enemy continued attacking. Weak, tired, disorganized, the German soldier now faced not only the cold and the Soviets, but also the loss of what kept him going: discipline, order, purpose. Without that, all that remained was instinct, and instinct in that scenario dictated one thing above all others: survive, even if it means leaving everything behind. The Soviet counterattack. While the German army struggled to avoid collapsing under the weight of cold, hunger, and exhaustion, the other side began to gain strength. The Red Army, which in the first few months had been brutally pushed back, now emerged different, more organized, more resilient, and, above all, better. Prepared for that environment, the winter, which was devastating the Germans, strengthened the Soviets. The Russian troops were equipped for it. They wore heavy clothing suitable for extreme temperatures. They moved more easily in the snow. They knew where to take shelter, where to hide, where to attack. For them, that scenario was not an obstacle. It was an advantage, and they started using it precisely. The counterattack didn't come as a single burst of force. It came in waves, constant, coordinated blows, pressing weak points in the German line. Where there was attrition, they attacked. Where there was isolation, they surrounded. And there were many of those points. T-34 tanks began to appear on the white landscape, advancing with an efficiency that surprised the Germans. Unlike many German vehicles, they performed better in extreme cold. Their wide tracks allowed them to traverse deep snow more easily, and when they appeared, it was too late to react. They loomed like heavy shadows on the horizon, forcing their way through weakened positions, crushing any resistance that still tried to stand. Behind them came the Soviet infantry, determined men hardened by war and winter itself. There was no more disorganized retreat. Now, that was progress. The Germans, once accustomed to attacking, found themselves forced to defend, often without the means to do so. Fragile lines, exhausted soldiers, malfunctioning weapons. Each Soviet attack was like a direct blow to a already broken structure, and that structure was beginning to give way. Cities that had been conquered with ease now became points of intense fighting. The Soviets knew the terrain, using every street, every building, every ruin as a defensive and offensive position. Battles took place at close range, brutal, fast, with no room for error, and the cold was ever present. The wounded froze before receiving help. Weapons fell to the ground and froze along with the hands that held them. Explosions kicked up snow and ice, mixing everything with blood, creating an almost unreal scene. At the same time, attacks from the flanks and rear began to intensify. German units, already isolated, were being pressured from all sides. Without efficient communication, many didn't even know they were being surrounded until it was too late. It was a siege that was slowly closing in. No rush, no need for desperate attacks. The Soviets knew that time was on their side. Each day of extreme cold further weakened the enemy. Each delay in supplies made the German situation more critical. All they had to do was maintain the pressure and wait. And they did exactly that. For the German soldiers, the feeling was clear. Control of the war had changed hands. The unstoppable advance was over. Now they were being pushed, hunted, pressured. And the worst part of all was knowing there was nowhere to run. Behind them lay the same devastated territory through which they had advanced. Ahead, an enemy that was now coming with everything. And all around, winter. The true master of that war. The invisible siege. Amid the escalating chaos, something even more dangerous was happening, something many German soldiers didn't realize until it was too late. The siege. But not a classic siege, with well-defined lines, visible trenches, or clear movements on the map. No, this one was different. It was slow, silent, almost invisible. The German units continued fighting, retreating, trying to reorganize. Poor communication led each group to believe they were still part of a larger line, a continuous front. But in reality, that line no longer existed. She had broken down. Small groups were scattered across kilometers of frozen territory, separated from each other by snow, forests, and enemy forces. And between these groups, the Soviets moved, cutting corners, intercepting routes, closing off access. Without the Germans fully realizing it, the escape routes began to disappear. Roads that were once used for supply and evacuation were now blocked. some by destruction, exploded bridges, abandoned vehicles, others by enemy presence. And often, the blockade wasn't permanent. It was just enough to confuse, delay, disorient, and that was enough. Because in that environment, losing control for even a few hours could be fatal. Patrols sent to find alternative routes returned with contradictory information when they returned at all. Some reported enemy presence in unexpected locations. Others simply disappeared like so many before. The feeling of isolation grew stronger. Officers tried to mentally redraw the positions of their units, but the data was incomplete, outdated, and often incorrect. Maps no longer reflected reality. What was marked as safe might at that moment be occupied by the enemy, and nobody knew for sure. The soldiers began to experience this firsthand. They tried to retreat along a known route and encountered resistance. They changed direction and were attacked. Again, small skirmishes broke out in all directions as if the enemy were everywhere, and in a way, it was. The siege didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to be closed with absolute precision. It just needed to be confusing enough to prevent any coordinated movement. And that was exactly what was happening. German units began to move aimlessly, trying to find a way out, a point of contact, any sign of organization. But the more they moved, the more lost they became, and the more they got lost, the more vulnerable they became. The cold, hunger, and exhaustion made everything worse. Decisions were made under extreme pressure, with little information and almost no margin for error. One wrong turn could lead directly to an ambush. A stop for rest could mean never getting up again. And in the midst of all this, the enemy continued to press on. Quick, precise attacks, always targeting the weakest points. There was no need for large-scale offensives. The encirclement already did much of the work. The Soviets were simply tightening the pressure, little by little, like a trap that slowly closes. For the Germans, the realization came in isolated moments. An officer who realizes he can no longer contact any nearby unit. A group that tries to retreat and discovers there is no clear path. A soldier who looks around and understands for the first time that he is completely surrounded. No escape route, without support, with no clear hope of rescue. And the worst part, without knowing exactly when it happened, because there wasn't a single unique moment. There was no warning. The siege simply happened, silent, invisible. And when it was finally noticed, it was already too late. Men who simply disappeared with the siege closing in silently and disorganization taking hold of the German lines. Something even more disturbing began to become evident, not only to the soldiers on the front lines, but also to the military records themselves. Entire units were disappearing. At first, they were isolated reports, a battalion that no longer responded to calls, a company that had been sent to reinforce a position and never arrived. Officers tried to make contact by radio, only static. Messengers were sent and didn't return. But as the days went by, these accounts began to accumulate, and the pattern was always the same. There were no major battles recorded, no massive clashes that would explain such significant losses. There were no survivors arriving to tell what happened. There were no positions clearly destroyed by heavy artillery. There was only absence. Maps began to show gaps. Areas where organized troops should have been present were simply empty. Higher commands demanded explanations, required detailed reports, but the officers on the front lines had no answers, because they didn't know either. Some tried to reconstruct the events based on fragments, a final radio contact mentioning enemy movement. An isolated soldier found days later, in a state of shock, unable to clearly explain what he saw. Tracks in the snow that ended abruptly, as if the men had evaporated. There were even stranger cases. Patrols sent to investigate suspicious areas found signs of recent presence. Extinguished campfires, abandoned equipment, footprints crisscrossing the terrain, but no bodies, no clear signs of combat, only indications that something had happened and then disappeared. The cold contributed to this in a cruel way. Bodies could be quickly covered by snow, hidden in a matter of hours. Storms erased any trace of fighting. Equipment could be taken, reused, or simply buried under layers of ice. The scene cleaned itself, as if nothing had happened, but the numbers didn't lie. Lists of missing soldiers grew rapidly. Names were added without confirmation of death, without location, without explanation. Just one word: missing. And that word began to weigh heavily. For the officers, it was a logistical and strategic nightmare. How could they plan operations without knowing the location of their own forces? How could they rely on positions that might no longer exist? How could they send reinforcements if there was no certainty of where to send them? For the soldiers, it was something even worse. It was the fear of leaving no trace, to die without witnesses, to have no body found, to have no story told, to simply cease to exist in that immense white void. Some began to talk about it in hushed tones. They said that certain units were being swallowed up, that there were areas where no one should enter, that the terrain itself, combined with the enemy, created something impossible to predict. But in reality, what was happening was even more brutal. Small, isolated groups were quickly surrounded by mobile Soviet forces, without communication, without support, without the capacity for prolonged resistance. They were silently eliminated, sometimes captured, other times killed and left behind, quickly hidden by the snow. No witnesses, without clear records, and so they disappeared. At that point, the war was no longer just about territory or battles. It was about survival in an environment where even death could go unnoticed. And as time went on, more men were added to that invisible list. Men who marched confidently at the start of the invasion. And now, they simply weren't there anymore. The hell of ice. Winter has reached its cruelest point. There was no more adaptation possible. There was no more gradual resistance. Everything that could be tested had already been tested, and now all that remained was to endure or die. Temperatures plummeted even further, reaching levels that few of those men could even comprehend. It wasn't just cold. It was something that completely dominated the atmosphere. The air felt solid. Each breath burned from the inside. The simple act of taking a deep breath could cause pain in the lungs, and the world around us seemed dead. The silence was absolute at many moments. There were no birds, there was no movement, only the wind cutting through the white landscape, carrying fine snow that hit the face like needles. And in the midst of this scene were the bodies. Bodies that no longer fell as they once did. Now, many remained where they had died, standing, frozen in their last moments of life. Soldiers were found leaning against trees, weapons still in their hands, eyes open, as if observing something in the distance. Others were kneeling, as if they had tried to stand up, but couldn't complete the movement. Some appeared to be asleep, but they weren't. The cold preserved everything, expressions, positions, even the smallest details of the final moment. It was as if time had stopped exactly at the instant of death, and this had a profound impact on those who were still alive, because that wasn't just death, it was a warning. The soldiers who passed by these bodies didn't need an explanation. They saw what happened to those who didn't survive, and they knew they could be next. The cold made no distinction. The wounded were the first to succumb. Unable to move, without adequate shelter, many simply froze to death. Cries for help grew weaker over time until they disappeared completely. And there wasn't always a way to help. The living could barely take care of themselves. Weapons kept malfunctioning. Lubricants froze. Metals became stiff and brittle. Trying to operate a rifle with numb fingers was a desperate task. Many soldiers would take off their gloves for seconds, and in those seconds they would already feel their skin burning from the cold, and every mistake could be fatal. Abandoned vehicles piled up across the landscape, tanks that no longer worked, trucks left behind, heavy equipment that couldn't be salvaged, everything stopped, frozen, useless, as if the war had been interrupted, but only for one side, because the enemy was still on the move. The Soviets continued attacking, exploiting every weakness, every flaw. But now, often, they didn't even need to attack directly. The cold did the work for them. All we had to do was wait. And waiting, in that scenario, was a powerful weapon. The Germans began to realize that they were fighting an impossible battle at that moment. Not for lack of courage, not for lack of will, but because the environment didn't allow for victory. The human body has limits, and those limits were being exceeded every day. Some soldiers, completely exhausted, were beginning to lose track of what was happening. They spoke incoherently. They stared blankly into space. Some laughed for no apparent reason. Others wept silently. The mind was beginning to give way, as was the body. And in the midst of this frozen hell, one reality was becoming increasingly clear. The war had ceased to be fought solely against a human enemy. Now, it was against the world itself, and the world was winning. The desperate withdrawal. The time had come when there was no longer any way to deny it. The advance was over, the offensive had failed, and now all that remained was to try to get out of that white hell alive. The order to retreat began to emerge, sometimes clear, sometimes confusing, sometimes not at all. But even without formal orders, many soldiers already understood. Staying meant death. We had to retreat. But retreating in that scenario wasn't simply a matter of turning back. It was like going through everything again that had already destroyed them. Only, now in even worse conditions, the roads were practically non-existent anymore. Paths were covered in deep snow or blocked by abandoned vehicles. Bridges had been destroyed, trails disappeared under storms, and the enemy was now in every direction. The withdrawal began in a disorganized manner. Entire units moved simultaneously, without clear coordination. Soldiers walked side by side with unusable tanks, stopped trucks, and dead horses left behind. Heavy equipment was abandoned along the way, not by choice, but out of necessity. It was impossible to carry everything, and gradually it became impossible to carry even the basics. The men no longer had the strength. Many could barely walk. Each step was an extreme effort. Their bodies, weakened by hunger and cold, simply did not respond as before. Some walked in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground, concentrating all their energy solely on continuing. Others couldn't, and it was at that moment that the withdrawal revealed its cruelest side. A soldier fell. He tried to get up. He failed. His comrades stopped for a few seconds trying to help, but they quickly realized the reality. Stopping for too long meant putting everyone at risk. And then came the decision. Leave it behind, or die with it. Many were left behind. Some were still conscious, watching as the others followed. Others were too weak to react. Some pleaded. Others simply accepted it. And the snow did the rest. Without shelter, without movement, the body lost heat. Rapidly, within minutes, the shivering subsided. Soon silence returned, and yet another man disappeared. Soviet attacks continued during the retreat. They weren't massive offensives. They were constant, calculated blows. Small groups attacked the moving columns, striking the most vulnerable, causing panic and further disrupting their organization. And each attack increased the chaos. Some soldiers scattered, trying to escape the confrontation. But this only worsened the situation. Isolated and without direction, they ended up lost in that vast, frozen territory. And the fate of these men was almost always the same: disappear. The vehicles that were still operational were in high demand. Injured people tried to fit inside them, but space was limited. Difficult decisions had to be made: who would get in and who would stay. There was no easy choice. The retreat, which was supposed to be an attempt to salvage what remained, turned into a process of continuous attrition. With each kilometer retreated, More men were lost, not only in combat, but to the cold, to hunger, to exhaustion. And yet, they kept walking, because stopping wasn't an option. The objective was no longer to hold positions or win battles. It was to reach any place where there was still structure, shelter, supplies, any sign of survival. But that place always seemed too far away, and many never arrived. For those who survived, the retreat was remembered as something worse than the advance itself. Because there was no longer any hope of victory. The only struggle was to avoid being the next one to fall and disappear. The dark legacy. The army that the snow swallowed when winter finally began to recede and the ice gave way to an even crueler terrain, the heavy mud of spring. What remained of the German army was no longer the confident force that had crossed the border months before. It was something else, fragmented, exhausted, scarred. The units that had managed to retreat began to reorganize, but the numbers didn't add up. Lists were reviewed, names were called, and silence answered. Officers sifted through incomplete reports, trying to understand what had happened to so many divisions, so many battalions, so many men. But there were no clear answers, just gaps. Thousands of soldiers were missing, not confirmed dead, not officially captured, just absent. No final records, no location, no reliable witnesses. In many cases, the last information was a broken contact, a lost position, an incomplete message. And then, nothing. The battlefield, now partially revealed by the thaw, was beginning to tell its own story, but in a fragmented way. Bodies were found months later, preserved by the cold, scattered across forests, roads and open fields. Some still in formation, others alone, far from any known unit. But for every body found, many others never turned up. The snow had hidden everything. Storms erased all traces. Quick battles left no record. And the territory, itself vast and unforgiving, swallowed men as if they had never been there. It was a war without any real witnesses. The survivors carried these memories, not as organized stories, but as fragments, loose images, sensations, the sound of the wind, the silence after an attack, the sight of a comrade left behind, the constant doubt about what had happened to those who disappeared. And that question was never fully answered. For the German command, the campaign marked the end of any illusion of a quick victory in the East. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. On the contrary, it had resisted, adapted, and counterattacked forcefully. But more than that, there was something that couldn't be measured by maps or numbers alone. The human impact. An entire army entered that territory with confidence, discipline, and a sense of control. And it left, when it left, bearing deep physical and psychological scars. Many never returned. Others did return. But they were never the same, because what happened there was not just a military defeat. It was a confrontation with something bigger, with the climate, with the territory, with the limits of the human body and mind, and above all, with the reality that in that war, not all the dead would be found. Not all of them would be identified, and many would simply disappear from history, swallowed by the snow, as if they had never existed, but they did exist. And the echo of what they lived through still remains, not only in the incomplete records, but in the stories told, in the fragmented accounts, and in the memory of a winter that did not only defeat an army, but he made it disappear.